Morning folks. Today's video is going to be a little bit different than the ones I've done before. Today we're going to talk about what's going on in industry and specifically in kind of unicorn land. And today's topic is the near Theranosian decline of WeWork and the recently announced SoftBank bailout of WeWork. For those that don't know about WeWork, have a look at them. They're basically a shared working space that kind of targets themselves towards millennials and startups. So yesterday it was announced that SoftBank was going to be injecting another $8 billion of funds into a very beleaguered WeWork. And just so we're clear, my favorite headline about this so far has been from the BBC, which says, and I'm paraphrasing, but so excuse me, but says something along the lines of, WeWork has accepted SoftBank's bailout of $8 billion. Now, my favorite analogy of this comes from a guy named Rich Young, a guy that I work with in my company, and his exact kind of analogy of that is, that headline may say, unconscious bleeding man accepts stitches. The reality is WeWork didn't have an option. They have to take that cash injection. Otherwise, they're going to be in a scenario where next year they're not solvent. The $8 billion injection looks something along the lines of $5 billion of cash for the business, of capital for the business to be able to execute on, which they say is an acceleration of a planned $1.5 billion investment next year. So $5 billion this year is an awful lot more than $1.5 billion next year. There's a thing called time value of money, so it's not linear, it's a little bit different. But $5 billion this year is at the very, just linearly is a $3.5 billion increase on what they were planning on putting in next year. The other $3 billion is for specifically to buy up shares in the organization, and specifically $1.7 billion for WeWork's beleaguered and now ousted ex-CEO and founder, a guy named Adam Neumann. Now, SoftBank have come out and said, look, we're gonna keep Adam on as an observer. Now, I'm not saying I'm some kind of expert on business. I'm not. I pretend that I know what I'm doing, and I've taken a few courses. I've got a degree in this. I've taken some training from the Institute of Directors here in the United Kingdom. I'm not saying I'm an expert. However, in none of my readings, in none of my learnings have I ever come across the title of observer. Now, that allows me to make my own interpretation of what observer means. And here's what I think observer is. SoftBank is going to be saying to Mr. Neumann, Adam, we're going to give you $1.7 billion. And what you're going to do with that $1.7 billion is you're going to sit quietly and not going to say much, and we're going to stick you in the corner. And when we go into a room with a bunch of investors and we need to inspire them, we're going to wheel you out and you're going to start being charming and charismatic, and you're going to start spouting some bullshit about raising the world's consciousness, which is WeWork's vision statement. Interesting for a real estate business. And then we're going to politely ask you to quietly go back to the corner of the room and not say anything until we ask you to come back out again. Now, for $1.7 billion, hey, maybe that's a decent job. But the reality is, it's obvious that Adam's leadership of the organization has kind of suffered a little bit, and specifically the idolization of this kind of charming and charismatic kind of leader has led to a scenario where the organization's in a bit of free fall. Now, about 6 weeks ago, there was a planned kind of public offering for WeWork. The organization was going to go public, and they were in the States. That's an IPO and an S6 listing, and they were. I think SoftBank and WeWork were drinking their own Kool-Aid, right? Bearing in mind the $10.6 billion, at this point, SoftBank had already put $10.6 billion into WeWork, and that had netted them about a 30% ownership of the equity in the organization. So there was this planned kind of IPO to take a lot of those shares and go public with them. They were drinking their own Kool-Aid and thinking that the valuation of the business was going to be somewhere between 45 and 47 billion. The reality is they kind of go to the market, they start taking some temperatures, and the answer that comes back looks more like 11 to 12 billion. Hey, sucks about math, by the way, but that's kind of how these things work once you get beyond all the idolatry and kind of charisma. So SoftBank's in trouble at this point, and specifically their $100 billion vision fund is kind of looking at this and going, oh shit. And they've got an option at this point. They've got 10.6 billion already invested. They've got 30% equity. Now, at a 47 billion kind of valuation of the organization, that looks pretty good. The math looks pretty good. 10.6 billion, 30%, you're already netting a return, even if you walk away from it at that very time. The reality is it comes back as 11 to 12 billion. Now, SoftBank could very easily at that point say, you know what, this kind of sucks, but we drank the Kool-Aid and now we are where we are. We've got 30% equity. We can sell our 30% equity at today's valuation of 11 to 12 billion, and that returns us anywhere between 3.3 and 3.6 billion, right? Now, they've already got 10.6 billion kind of put into it. So at best, that's a $7 billion loss. At worst, it's kind of around 7.3 billion. Kind of sucks, but it's actually recoverable. Especially in a $100 billion vision fund. Instead, what SoftBank have chosen to do is double down on the 10.6 billion that they've already put in, and actually then say, actually, we're going to put another 8 billion, an increase of 80% on their initial investment. Now, to be fair to them, that returns them an extra 50% of the equity in the business. They now own, or they will soon own, about 80% of the organization, which is fine. But sticking with the kind of the blackjack analogy, doubling down on WeWork, in my opinion, is incredibly risky. It's kind of like doubling down on a hard 5 when the dealer's showing a king. You got to ask yourself, what are you doing? Why not just cut your losses and get out? The reality is, though, they're staying in the game, which is great for us because this shit's better than television. That's it for today's video. As always, stay happy, be nice to each other, and we'll see you next time.